Hello again. In this clip, we'll continue on and we'll start talking about the history, polity, culture, and all that of the ancient Israel and Judah. This time, the sources would really heavily rely on biblical narrative, and we will go through some historical background that may be at the back of the records that we have in the Old Testament. So we'll refer to the notes that I have given to you, the handout uh, that is on this particular subject. So ancient Israel and Judah. The word ancient here actually refers to the time when there's an existence of a what do you call this primitive or ancient, as in the olden days of Israel and Judah, not referring to the Israel of today, the modern Israel that is only in existence since 1948 after the Second World War. So this refers to the biblical narratives that depict how this particular nation or people, Israel, come about. So very closely related to the records in the Old Testament. Let us first look at the time periods, particularly of ancient Israel and Judah. This is a chronology table that is presented by Collins in his book. You can refer to it if you have it. You can get it from the library, or you can actually have access to an online copy if you are resourceful enough. Now, there is two columns here that you can see from the table. The approximate dates implied in the Bible for early history. There is a person, can't remember his name, but the name, someone, I think Usler or something like that, James Usler, who actually proposed a theory by looking at the records in the Old Testament, trying to deduce and say, when did the earth come into place, in creation and so on and so forth. So based on the Bible's narrative of when certain thing happened, so this is the theory about the dates. So according to this theory, you can see that they talk about the creation actually happens at around 4000 BCE. Thus, the theory that the earth has only been in existence for probably 6,000 over years. But according to modern chronology, which means referring to scientific proof and things like that, right? There are different estimation of the historical age of the earth, and therefore when did certain events in the Bible happen. So what is regarded as 4000 BC for creation, scientists actually look at this and say the age of the earth, they deduce to be approximately 4.5 billion years. Okay, there is a whole theological debate about it. I'm not going into that. There are group that are known themselves as fiat creationists, which means this fiat as FIAT, right? So fiat creationists would be holding to this view, right, where they look at the Bible and take what the Bible say literally, to conjecture, to deduce what is the age of the earth and all this. And when they say creation, one day means one day, 2 day means 2 day, like what we have today when we say 1 day, 2 day. And then on the other side, there are some what we call what they call already, something like biblical evolutionists or something like that, right? There's a whole range of theory out there that talks about what it means, when is creation, and so on and so forth. Did God really created one man and one woman, or created a lot, and the story is, that kind of thing. So I'm not going into the theological aspect of that. I think you will learn that when you come to theology. So yeah, so there are two columns here. What you would want to consider in this table is to look at the differences, and you can tell basically up to the point of the division of kingdom from 922 BCE. Before that, the dates are all disputable. There are various theories about when and what happened. Okay, so like here 4000 and 2400 BCE, the flood of Noah, and so on and so forth, and all the way. And Abraham is dated according to, based on this kind of a biblical historian, go for 2100. But the modern scholars tend to believe that it's a date that is around 1800 BCE or so, right, for Abraham. But as I said, disputable, right? So various theories, and we're not sure when the is what you call the sons of Jacob or went into Egypt. Some, according to the biblical historian, again they say it's 1875. Probably if we take 1800 to be Abraham time, then it must be later than that, probably 1700 or 1600 BCE that they moved into Egypt. And according to the biblical historian, Exodus happened at around 1400 BCE, right? Again, well, disputed by the modern chronologists who actually look at the history, like we have gone through the history of all Egypt and so on and so forth. It's more likely to be have happened during the time of Ramesses. That is when all the great architecture of Egypt, all the pyramid, Sphinx, all these projects are in place, and they need a lot of slaves. So it's likely that it's probably around 1250, 1200 BCE or so that they actually go through the Exodus from Egypt. And Colin put down here, disputed. In other words, we don't really know when, but it seems that this is most reliable date to be considered. So this chronological table is very important for you. Even if this is a recorded lecture, I want to remind you that for your test, this area, right, this table is very important. You need to know the major dates, like for instance, when did Exodus happen? And when I ask the question, if the question come out, right, okay, when I ask the question, I'm referring to the modern chronology, not the biblical one. Basically, we want to try to link what the Bible say with whatever that we have in terms of archaeological evidence and about history and so on and so forth. So if I ask a question, when did Exodus happen? Then you answer probably 1200, 1200 something BCE. Again, the question will be multiple choice. It will be easy for you to pick up the answer anyway, right? So they come out here, and again, we are not quite sure when the Israelite actually appear in Canaan. So there is a wide spread of time, probably around 1200 or so, up to 1000. Then, you begin to see these people called Israel settling in Canaan. And by the time of 1000 BCE, then you begin to see the biblical record people, the biblical historians, so to say, and the modern chronology one start to go in sync, because more and more archaeological evidence come to actually help us to see when has David been. So, well, again, this is disputed. It would be between 1000 to 950 BCE that we say the monarchy of King David is established in Jerusalem, and this date is disputed. And so is King Solomon. It's said 960 to 922 approximately, and that is disputed also. But that's the best guess, I suppose, we can have based on the archaeological evidence we have today, right, according to Collins. So again, all these dates you need to remember, like 1200. These are what you call this chronological temporal markers that is important in indication Israel, the Israelites, the children of Israel actually enter into Canaan at around 1200 BCE. They come out from Egypt 1200 plus. They enter into Canaan 1200 to 1100 BCE. By 1000 BCE, they establish a monarchy with David as their king. And then 960 or 950 or so, King Solomon succeeded the father, because David reigned 40 years. So if you say David become king at 1000, then Solomon is 960, right? But we cannot say for sure. So it's around there. Around 1000, David become king. Around 960, 950, Solomon become king, and so on and so forth. But what is quite sure is 922. From 922 onward, Collins say the implied biblical dates are generally compatible with those of modern scholarship based on archaeological evidence referring to Assyrian chronicles, Babylonian chronicles, and so on and so forth. There's indication that by 922, there is already two kingdoms called Israel and Judah in the Syro-Palestinian plain, right? So then you have the division kingdom already happened. Okay, so this is also an important date to remember, 922. But I don't think that's a how do you call this? That's a definite date, but at least something for us to hammer on. So this is probably entering into Iron Age 2 by 1000 or 960 or something like that. This is already early Iron Age. In fact, when they come into Canaan, 1100 or something like that, is already early Iron Age. By the time you come into 900 BCE, they are already entering into a late Iron Age or Iron Age 2. The what do you call this? The iron metallurgy kind of knowledge has already become more and more advanced. So they're entering into Iron Age. Wars are fought with a weapon made by metal, right? Okay, and things like that, made of metal. So important dates again, 722, 721. That is the destruction of the northern kingdom, Israel. Assyria came down, destroyed the kingdom, and then 621. This is the Reformation in Jerusalem for the Yahwistic cult. That's when King Josiah of Judah became king, and he found the book of the law, right? This is 2 Kings 23, right? So he found the book of the law, which is of the Deuteronomistic law form, and basically if we want to trace back, we might say that the Yahwistic cult, or the religion to worship Yahweh as the only God, or the high God, or the Elyon, the most high, and things like that, probably officially begin in the kingdom of Judah during this time. Although they were already worshiping El, Yahweh, and things like that culturally, but it is until the Reformation by King Josiah, 621 BCE, that it became a kind of a national cult from a historical and anthropological angle. Then 597, the first time Babylonian came down. Actually, this is already the second time, but we say the first time because this is the first time when deportation happened. 597, capture of Jerusalem by Babylonians, and then deportation of kings and nobles to Babylon. King Jehoiakim, and it's believed that people like Ezekiel, Daniel, and these people might have been also taken during this raid in 597. It is until 586 that the complete destruction of Jerusalem took place. Babylonians come again because Zedekiah rebelled. Again, we talked about that in the last lecture. Zedekiah rebelled. He go and call for all the small states in Syro-Palestinian plain and plan a kind of a revolt against Babylonia. And Nebuchadnezzar come and root him out, right? And then blinded him, chained him, and brought him back to Babylon and imprisoned him. So more extent of what they call deportation, and according to the Bible, all the rich and all the economically advantaged people has already been taken to Babylon, and what is left only are the, according to the Bible, quote, poorest of the land, right? But having said that, historically and from a kind of archaeological angle, we find that the kind of deportation, this kind of description seems to have only happened in the area of Jerusalem and the nearer surrounding area. In other parts of Judah, life basically goes on. Remember, in those days, nations are not governed like today when you have a central government taking care of infrastructure of everyone in the entire realm of the country. All the administration are only centered on the city like Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was the city. So all the king is there, the army is there, and the political administration center are there. And they actually mainly that is the major place. So when the Babylonians come or any other country come, they go and destroy Jerusalem. They really don't have time to go and take care of every little village around the all over the place in Judah. So archaeological evidence seems to show that the destruction, the worst destruction could have happened mostly in Jerusalem and probably the nearer region around Jerusalem. The rest of the place in Judah, life goes on, right? People of Judah still live there. They still plant their vineyard. They still take care, right? So when the Bible says the poorest of the land, they probably mean these peasants who doesn't have any political power, who doesn't, is not any kind of threat for that matter, political wise and military wise to the Babylonian invaders and colonizers. So they are left in the land taking care of the vineyard because somehow the colonizer, the Babylonians, would still want the economic produce of the land, right? So that is the situation. Then 539 is also a groundbreaking year. That's the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus of the Great of Persia. And then the exiles were allowed to return to Jerusalem. And this is the end of the exile. Judah became a province of Persia with governor that is appointed by Persia, Jewish governor, Hebrew governor, Judahite governor. But take note, in the Bible, we have always heard that the promise was that, in Jeremiah, 70 years later, you will return and things like that. But you say, hey, the destruction 586 to 539 is not 70 years yet. Okay, so there is explanation that says 70 years refers to the first time when Babylonian come. Some say it refers to the time when Jeremiah says it until the coming back of it. Again, there are a lot of theory explaining this. The point, though, is that you can note that from 586 to 539 is not really 70 years, probably just around one generation away, about 40 years or so. So they return. But then you have to think also, because 539, Cyrus gave the decree. It doesn't mean that that year itself, they would have already populated Jerusalem, go back there. It takes some years for them to return. And in fact, biblical records show us that there are a few waves of return. Ezra, and then later Zerubbabel, and then Nehemiah. So the rebuilding of Jerusalem and temple only start in 520. That's when Haggai was saying about it and so on and so forth. And Ezra returns as 458. So if you go 586 and 458, probably you can get 70, right? So the what do you call this? The prophecy of 70 years probably is not meant to be like an exact number for you to count. When is it, from when to when? It is probably a kind of a representation of a kind of a oracular and prophetic recognition that there will be a time when Yahweh will show mercy to their to his people and let them go back, right? So, and that is a religious, how do you call that, belief of the the rabbis, okay, the religious teachers and things like that of the among the exile in Babylon and in Persia, who constantly teach the people of Yahweh that one day we will go back. Repent, believe in him, turn your hearts to him, rely on him. Yahweh will not let us down. He will take us back to our homeland. And one day that happens, they have the chance to go back. Okay, so this is the table. Again, I want to stress for the quiz in on the ninth session that we have. I believe it's like early March or something like that. In the quiz, this what you call time markers, things like 722, 586, 1200, all this. So these are important. At least you know from a chronological event, right? Even 458, 539. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you say you have learned the Old Testament and you understand it, all these numbers should mean something to you, so that you know how the chronology of the event happened in the Old Testament in terms of the timing, which year, what happened, and so on and so forth. Okay, let's continue. So now we're going to move to the progression, the historical chronology part, slowly one by one. So the first part, today we'll cover until this part only, that is from the Patriarch to Exodus. So let me run through a very quick view. So when we look at the history of ancient Israel and Judah, according to the biblical narratives, well, we can actually divide it into several periods. Like first, there is this period from the Patriarch, which means the ancestors, the fathers of the people of Israel, up to the Exodus from Egypt. That's one period of time. And then there's a pre-monarchy Israel, before they have a kingdom. So there's a time, right? There's a period of time from a political angle. Then there will be a time when we enter into the time of the United Kingdom, when David and Solomon formed the Hebrew kingdom, and they were together until a time where we go to the divided kingdom. So the kingdom divided, become the northern kingdom Israel and the southern kingdom Judah. And from then on, we will be looking at the northern kingdom development and the southern kingdom's development. And then when Assyrian come and rule, that is the time to consider. Maybe the northern kingdom has died, but the southern kingdom is still threatened by Assyrian Empire and under Babylonian rule. When Babylonia come, and finally, I think there is a little part about the destruction and the exile, final destruction of Judah, and so on and so forth. And moving on towards the time when the Persian Empire is in power. Okay, so this is how the progression of history run. At the end, I will also bring you through a section called the People and Society, which we will look into the origin of Israel and Israelite and what is their society like and their culture and so on and so forth. So they help us, to having understanding of this background, help us to actually understand the, what do you call this, the Bible better with the understanding of the culture and background. Okay, so today we only want to look at 311 from the Patriarch to Exodus, this period of time. Right, so the main reference is this book by Miller and Hayes, and this section is from page 62 to 67. So first of all, in the Bible, there is one part, right, in Genesis chapter 1 to 11, which is known as the primeval history according to Collins. And you should note that before Genesis chapter 12, things move rather quickly. From Genesis 1 to 11, we have no idea how long is the time period that has passed for this. Could have been thousands and could have been millions of years for all that to happen, depending on what is your theological view about creation and so on and so forth, right? But anyway, this is a primeval history tradition, probably stories that were passed down by the Hebrews generation to generation orally. The father tell the son tell the grandson, and so on and so forth, until a certain time when scribes, or some people say Moses, okay, actually pick up the pen and put it down on the papyrus or the stone tablet or whatsoever, right? Record it down. Okay, so this chapter 1 to 11, you can see that from chapter 1 to 3 is the narrative, the story about the creation of the world and human, and then the expulsion of the first human couple from Eden, and so on and so forth. So of course, there are still up to today plenty of questions about this. Did God really just create, first couple like that, or how then, if that is the case, how did Cain got his wife, that kind of thing, or a lot of this kind of, and so on and so forth. So these are all theological question of biblical difficulty to be covered from a theological angle. So we will not cover it here. I'm going to just tell you how the progress of the narrative go. And you can compare this, how do you call this? Shall we say legendary kind of narrative of the creation of human? You can look at some of these Enuma Elish, Babylonian creation story, which is Enuma Elish, and the Assyrian version of the creation or the existence, origin of the earth and the universe that is told in this particular epic called Gilgamesh. Epic Gilgamesh. This is a Syrian version of the story, which is Akkadian influence, and the Babylonian creation story, Enuma, that is recorded in Enuma Elish. And yeah, there are YouTube that you can go through and just look at what is the story they have about how the world is created, and so on and so forth. And you probably see a bit of similarity in terms of the literary style, the contents or the progress of the story, which sort of give us an indication that perhaps the narrative that is set down for primeval history in the Old Testament has a bit of influence from the culture of the day, right? So in chapter 4 and chapter 5 is the kind of story about the subsequent development of human civilization from Cain, and then develop some more other human beings. And then you have the genealogy in chapter 5 that tell you who is whose son, and so on and so forth, until Noah, right? And then 6 to 9, there's a great flood and Noah's family. Again, there's some Bible difficulty here, the story of the great flood. Now, funny thing about the story of the great flood is, in most major civilization or anthropological study of all kinds of people on earth, you will find that somehow in everyone's story, there will be an instance similar to the great flood. Like once, that the God was angry with the world and destroyed the world for something. And sometimes they'll tell about the flood. Chinese has a story of the flood. Even back home where I am from in Sabah, the natives of Sabah, right, those tribal people, the Bumiputra in Malaysia we call, these tribal people, they also have the Kadazan Dusuns and all kind of these tribal rumors. They all have a certain version of the story of the great flood that destroyed the world, and how the creator preserved some human being to populate the earth, and so on and so forth. Interesting, huh? So in Asia particularly, it seems that this story is quite common among different cultural groups. Okay, and Noah's family, again, is like, some of us actually, if you look at chapter 6 and the beginning, suddenly it talk about the sons of God. The world has become very evil, and the sons of God came down and get married with the daughters of the human, and then very intriguing kind of tales that who are the sons of God and things like that, right? Okay, so those are interesting stuff that I think we will not totally understand until we see God and ask Him, what does it mean by that? What happened actually there, right? There's so many theories about it, right? Okay, so that's the Great Flood. So after the Great Flood, you come another genealogy, or some people call this the Book of the Nations in chapter 10, that tells us how certain people around Israel come about. Like, the Lord's, how, the descendants of Lot are Moabites, Ammonites, and then descendant of Edom, and so on and so forth. Basically, it can be viewed as a record for the Hebrew people in the past to come to an understanding of how these people around them is related to them in that sense, to tell them the story about how these people come about. How did the Egyptians come about? How did the Edomites come about? How did the Ammonites come about? And so on and so forth. For them to make sense of the world and the nations and the people around them. So that's the Book of the Nations in chapter 10, right? The genealogy. And then you have chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel story, right? So Tower of Babel tell us of, again, it is a story to tell them how eventually people are dispersed and having so many different languages and things like that, to explain the situation probably to the Hebrew who read this, to understand, how come people have different language from us, right? It was because of that incident. So and then you move on to chapter 12, which finally that leads to the, as a continuation from the genealogy, finally it moved to the hero of the story, Abram, right? The guy who eventually became or chosen by God to become the ancestor of the Israelite, the people of God later, right? So that's chapter 12. So chapter 1 to 11, the primeval story, basically is a fascinating compilation of events, okay, which actually would take us a lot of time to study, right? Some, you could even, just studying Genesis 1 to 11 is enough for you to write a very extensive thesis about what you think is the origin of mankind and so on and so forth, right? The creation story, and then, right? Even the study, the word study of it, the Genesis 1:1, when you say the Spirit of God moved upon the water, or just by looking at the Hebrew text, you can actually do a lot of theoretical conceptualization of what do you think the Word of God tell you, what does the Ruach Elohim, right, the Spirit of God there means, what is the implication of that verse to creation, and so on and so forth. So Genesis 1 to 11 itself could be construed, could be looked at as a, how do you say, a document or a book by itself. But you can see that eventually, essentially, this first 11 chapter of Genesis serve one major purpose, that is to bring finally the story to the point of concentration in Abram, the person who is chosen by God and who is called by God, and eventually being obedient and faithful to God, that his descendants become the people of God, Israel. Right? So then you come to the next phase of the history, that is in Genesis chapter 12 to 15. Now things move a bit slower already in graduation. I mean, if Genesis 1 to 11 may have taken thousands and millions of years to happen, I mean, depend on how you look at it, then from chapter 12 onwards, it's really about us on earth already, a human going, living and so on and so forth, right? So you have chapter 12 to chapter 22 that talks about how Abraham in the beginning moved from the land of Ur in Babylon, in southern Mesopotamia towards Canaan. But of course, in terms of the what do you call this, the real movement, looking at the map again, we refer back to the map of the Fertile Crescent. Yeah. He actually, Abraham and the father, right, Terah and the brother Nahor, they moved up here, Terah and Abraham and his wife and Lot, they moved up here and settled here in Haran. And it is here in chapter 12 that we see a calling for Abraham, right? According to Genesis chapter 12. But then interestingly, in Acts, when we read in the New Testament in Acts 7, in Stephen's testimony, he actually say that Abraham received the calling in Ur. So that's something to think about. Okay, so that's the movement. They move from Ur and go upward, northern part, and then move down to Canaan, follow the fertile place. And I have explained to you why, right? Because you just can't go straight over because of the terrain and so on and so forth. In those days, people travel along the river, right? So timing would be probably around 2000 BCE to 1900 BCE or so, right? Collins think it might be around 1800 BCE, right? That Abraham moved. So probably it's true because essentially he only settled in Canaan at around 1800 BCE when Isaac was born, right? So Isaac bin Abraham was born, and then later on this passed on to Jacob. Okay, so Isaac's son Jacob and Esau from chapter 25 to 36 onwards. This is the story of Jacob and Esau, how the contention between the two, and finally how Jacob actually inherited the blessings from God, so to say, from Abraham, the Abrahamic blessings and promise. Then from chapter 37 to 50 onward is the story of Joseph bin Jacob. So Joseph bin Jacob, right, the sons of Jacob, and the migration to Egypt eventually. So again, the migration, according to the biblical historian, would say this is somewhere around 1800 BCE. If you go by modern chronology, it could be 1700 to 1600 BCE, move down there, and then another 400 years later, they actually come out from Egypt, right? So that is the ancestor of Israel. Okay, so all these people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, to the Israelite, right? Or in general, we call them the patriarch. These are the fathers of the people of Israel. So it is when Jacob, right, and Jacob brought his sons into Egypt that eventually, in Exodus chapter 1, it mentioned that they grew in numbers and become so vast in number that the Pharaoh becomes scared of them. So Exodus 1 say, so eventually there's a Pharaoh that do have no knowledge of Joseph, made them slave and things like that, right? So that comes to the part where we address Moses and the Sinai covenant, the Mount Sinai covenant, probably around 1002, 1003 BCE, right? So in Exodus chapter 1 to 18 is the record of how the Hebrews, by this time, there's no nation called Israel yet. You have to understand, right? Israel at this point of time refer to the nickname of Jacob, Remember, he wrestled with God, and then God gave him a name. You will be called Israel. Wrestle with God, right? Okay. So they are Hebrews, basically. They're considered as Hebrews, and they are slaves in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. And in Exodus chapter 1 to 18 is a narrative about how these Hebrew slaves were freed from Egypt. There's no nation Israel yet. This is probably around 1,300 to 1250 BCE. Okay, and then entering into Exodus 19, after they run away, they came out from Egypt and go into the wilderness of Mount Sinai, or Mount Sinai, as the American would read it. Okay, that is the place where the birth of the nation, the ancient nation Israel, was born, according to the Bible, because that is where the covenant is made with God, and God made them a nation. It's like, imagine this, the meeting at Mount Sinai, right? Okay, it's like the how do you call this, the constitution forming of a nation, with the Decalogue, or with the 10 commandments given by God. Basically, God gave them a law and constitution to set up a nation. I mean, in today's speaking, right? Okay, so that's when the people of Hebrew, the Hebrew people, they come together, make a covenant with God, and set up this nation, or name themselves, give themselves an identity called Israel. That's why the title, the Hebrew title to the book Exodus, the title actually was taken from the Septuagint title, which means coming out from. Okay, but the original Hebrew title of the book Exodus, guess what? It actually means Shemot. It actually means he calls us name, or he named us, or our name, something like that, a name. Okay, so the whole crux of the story in Exodus is the fact that this group of Hebrew slaves finally found an identity as a nation, as a group of people collectively, and they call themselves Israel. Okay, because they are sons of Jacob, Israel, right? Okay, so they are Ben Israel, or Bani Israel, the son of Israel, right? So Israel becomes the name of the nation. So there is a law given, the covenant. Okay, mostly detailed out in Leviticus, and then repeated in Deuteronomy, some part of it in Exodus. We will come to that when we go and look at Pentateuch in details. And they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years because of this obedience and unfaithfulness, basically not believing in God, right? Power. So they were wandering in the wilderness, and there is the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers record that. And again, the title, the Hebrew title of the book of Numbers is interesting, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. Okay, that is the story of the Hebrew people, of this newborn nation, Israel, wandering in the wilderness. That is their story. And finally, before entering the promised land, it is said that Moses actually declared to them the law again, to remind them about the law of the Lord, and so on and so forth. And the book is called Davarim in Hebrew, which means the words. Okay, the words. But in Septuagint, it's called Deuteronomy. Deutero, right? Means this is a repetition. This is the second time, or things like that. So it's a repetition. So a repetition of the law that was given, probably written someplace in Exodus, and written in Leviticus also, and in Deuteronomy, it is repeated again to the people of Israel to remind them that you must follow the law, right? So the timeline probably of this Moses, Sinai, and up to the point they enter the promised land could be somewhere between 1300 to 1200 BCE. It might be that when they enter Canaan, it's already somewhere like 1200 BCE or less, something like that. Enter in early Iron Age, the pre-monarchy Israel, when they enter into Israel. Okay, so this is what I want to cover with you today. And basically, with this, we can conclude this lecture, and hope that you would cover the 2 lectures that I have prepared for you throughout this week of the holiday, and in waiting as we anticipate to meet one another again in the next session, which I will continue on to deliberate on the ancient Israel and Judah. So see you then. Take care and be, again, I remind you the chronology and things like that. These are something that is important for you to remember for the quiz. Now I'll keep on remind you about it, and I'll give you more briefing about how the test will be like. Okay, so see you and take care.